the nation was founded in 1789 under the Constitution. It was part of the compromising that they had to do to form the Constitution. And then every time we added new territory to the nation, the issue of slavery consistently came up, and the nation consistently compromised on this issue. Basically, just what I like to say, kicking the can down the road, saying somebody else is going to have to handle this. Somebody else is going to have to handle this. But pretty much everybody knew, like even Thomas Jefferson knew, that we would have to have a reckoning with this divide between the North and the South and on this issue of slavery. So this is the reckoning, and this is where we're at in our stage of history. So we're going to look at 10 separate issues that occurred from about 1850 to 1860 that led to the United States Civil War, where anywhere from 5 to 700,000 men or people died in that war. If you were to compare it to today's numbers, that looks more like 7 million people. So if that war, if we were to take those numbers and put them into today, that number would be equal to 7 million. 20% of Southern males died in this war. So we're going to look at why, like what happened, what led us to this point. So the very first issue in your notes that you're going to address is just a very fundamental issue. The North and the South were just very different. Economically, the North was industrialized. 90% of all of the factories in the United States were in the North. The South only had 2 factories, the Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, and I think the other one was in Alabama, but don't quote me on that. Tredegar Iron Works is the most important one. It actually made weapons for the United States Army before Virginia seceded from the Union. So again, the North had all of the factories, the South had 2. So very much industrialized, whereas we've talked about this before, the South was an agricultural-based, plantation-based society that relied on cash crops like cotton, tobacco, and then some minor crops like indigo, rice, and sugar. The North relied on immigrant labor, primarily Irish labor in their factories, whereas the South relied on enslaved labor. And then the North, even though they were so different, the North really did rely on the South, and the South relied on the North. The North needed the South for cotton to have in their factories to manufacture, and the South needed the North to provide them with the manufactured goods that they didn't produce. So, and that they didn't get from Great Britain. So these 2 regions of the United States are very different. And because their economies were so different, it led to the fact that their societies would also be very, very different. It was like going to a foreign country if you traveled from south to north or north to south. The North was much busier. It was more polluted. It was more populated by this point in our history. By the 1850s, there were more people living in the North than the South because of immigration, because we had industrialized. And it was just a faster pace of life. And there was at least maybe a hope of upward mobility in the North. So if you were poor, you could work toward becoming wealthy. Now, it was very rare that actually happened. Andrew Carnegie came here, Scottish, very, very poor, and then became one of the wealthiest men in history. But that wasn't the norm, but at least that was something that you could aspire to. Whereas the South was seen as being slower paced, the air was cleaner. In fact, it was a vacation destination for a lot of people from the North. But it had a very, very set class structure. There were 3 major white social classes, or 4 major white social classes in the South. You had at the very top your aristocracy, your plantation owners, the smallest group of Southerners, but they lived, a genteel life, big plantation houses, lots of enslaved people. They went to dinner parties, they were in the politics. And then right underneath those big plantation owners would be your smaller slave owners, who usually owned somewhere between 20 or fewer slaves. Some of them aspired to be big plantation owners, but the big plantation owners didn't want them to become big plantation owners. So whenever land would come up for sale and they knew that this smaller plantation plantation owner or the smaller slave owner might be interested in it, the big plantation owner would buy it up so that they couldn't, because they didn't want them to enter into that society. And then beneath the smaller plantation owner was the farmer who didn't own slaves. Didn't mean he didn't necessarily want to, but they were expensive and probably couldn't afford it. Some farmers aspired to become slaveholders and some did not. But again, very set class structure. So unlike the North, where you would have like the very wealthy living alongside the very poor in the cities, in the South, they were very distinctly separate. And so it's just very different culturally between the two as well. The second issue that would have to be dealt with is the issue of the Mexican Cession Territory. And if you don't know what this is, you're going to want to write it off to the side on your notes. But the Mexican Cession Territory is all of that land that we got from Mexico after the Mexican-American War. So it's California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Arizona and New Mexico. So now that we've claimed this territory from Mexico, the question becomes, how are we going to settle it and how are we going to organize it? And this became a very pressing issue around 1848, 1849, when gold was discovered in California. So many people moved to California in the United States that it is the largest migration of people in United States history. So many people moved from the East to get to California to find gold. And so their population grew so quickly that California was ready to become a state. And the question was, are they going to be free or slave? So Congress has to decide what they're going to do with these territories. And for the first time since 1820, when Missouri was admitted into the Union, the issue of slavery in territories has come up again, and they're arguing it. Should these territories be free, or should they be slave? So some congressmen looked to the Missouri Compromise. They said, hey, why don't we just take the Missouri Compromise line of 3630 and just move it straight across, like on across, and follow it all the way. And then north of that line be free and south of that line open to slavery. Well, that's not going to work. Southerners said that's not enough land for them. Like, that still puts more land in the clutches of the Northerners, but also it would cut California right in half. And can you have a state that's half slave, half free? Can you have a country that is half slave, half free? So it was roundly decided that the Missouri Compromise was not going to work for these territories. So we are now, for the first time since 1820, really dealing with this question regarding the Mexican Cession Territory. Will it be free or slave? Now, of course, the North wants to prohibit slavery from expanding into these territories, and the South wants it to be open to slavery. And, the North wanting to prohibit it, it wasn't necessarily all about morality. Were some Northerners upset about slavery as an immoral institution? Yes. Is that why they didn't want it to expand there? Yes. But ultimately, and a lot of it was the fact that if these territories were open to slavery, that means that there was a possibility that these territories would turn into more slave states, which means that there would be more slave states in the Union than free states, which means there would be more slave senators in the Congress than free senators. And the North at this point enjoyed a larger population than the South. They had more members in the House of Representatives, but the number of senators for both North and South was equal. So if you open these territories up to the slavery, then you might have more senators, pro-slavery senators in the Senate than Northern senators. So you upset this balance. So it was about keeping and maintaining power in Congress. Now, the South argued that slave ownership was a constitutionally protected right, and they weren't necessarily wrong about that, and we'll talk about that later. They said it should be up to the people or the territorial legislature, the people who make the laws in the territory, to regulate slavery, to say whether or not slavery can exist there, that it's not the job of the federal government, that it's a states' rights issue. So the states are the ones that should decide whether or not there will be slavery. The territories are the ones that should decide whether or not there will be slavery, not the federal government. This is an interesting argument for them to make, because this isn't the first time that the federal government has said anything about slavery in the territory. The first time that they did that was in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, when the federal government banned slavery in the Northwest territories of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, all of that. Then they did it again with the Missouri Compromise when they banned slavery north of 36 degrees 30. So the federal government had actually, had a say in whether or not slavery could expand into territories before. But now the issue has become incredibly contentious. And so Southerners are saying, no, this should definitely be something that is decided by the people. Oh, I'm not going to make you guys watch this, sorry. So what ends up happening is that this kind of gridlocks in Congress. There's really no decisions being made. So the congressman approached a very old, by this point, Henry Clay, who is dying of tuberculosis. And they say to him, Senator Clay, you fixed this issue before in the 1830s when the South threatened to secede over the tariff. You're the only one that can keep our union together. Can you please come up with a solution for our problem? And Henry Clay said, I absolutely can. Take away all of my other jobs and I will focus solely on this. And he locked himself in his office and he hammered out what we have come to call the Compromise of 1850. And the point of this compromise is to deal with the issue of slavery in the Mexican Cession territory. Now, this bill that Henry Clay created was huge. It had so many things included in it that once it hit the floor of, the Senate, there was no way that it was going to pass. There was so much to it that it was so easy for everybody to disagree on it that it couldn't get passed. Henry Clay dies before this bill even goes anywhere. So Stephen Douglas, who is a young senator from Illinois, says, hey, look, why don't we tear the bill apart? Why don't we break it down into smaller bills that would be easier to maneuver through Congress? And that's what they did. And so this is how we get the Compromise of 1850. It includes 5 different things that were passed, but we're only going to talk about 4. The first one is that California got admitted as a free state. Number 2 is that slavery in Utah and New Mexico would be determined by the people living there. Then number 3 included the Fugitive Slave Act, which actually gets its own issue. So if you're going to highlight something as being probably the most important of the Compromise of 1850, it would be the Fugitive Slave Act, which actually upset a lot of abolitionists in the North. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. And then number 4, it banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but not slavery. And this was like kind of a nod to the abolitionists, a nod to the North. A lot of abolitionists said this is a really bad look for us to be auctioning off people in our nation's capital when the rest of the world that's, the same level as the United States has already abolished slavery. Yes. So what they did in the Compromise of 1850 was made it illegal to auction enslaved people in the nation's capital. But you could still own slaves in the nation's capital, just could not auction slaves. So this is the Compromise of 1850 line. So the Missouri Compromise is still a thing. The Louisiana Purchase territory is still closed to slavery, but Utah and New Mexico are now opened to slavery by that compromise. So this paragraph here, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. This comes from the United States Constitution. So when it says no person held to service or labor, another way of saying that is enslaved person. Slave does not appear in the United States Constitution until the 13th Amendment that abolished it. But this is what this means. A person held to service or labor in one state. So an enslaved person from a southern state, under the laws of that state, if that person escapes into another state where slavery is illegal, that does not make them not a slave, meaning that they're still a fugitive slave and they have to be delivered or sent back to the party or the master that from whom they ran away. This is in the Constitution. This is what we call the Fugitive Slave Clause. So it's been in the Constitution since 1789, after the Constitutional Convention, that runaway slaves had to be returned, even if they were living in a free state. So the question is, if this was in the Constitution, why did the Congress feel the need to pass the Fugitive Slave Act in the first place? Well, because the Northerners weren't necessarily following it. Now, that being said, there were people who, like slave catchers, bounty hunters, who did go after enslaved people who had run away in the North and then return them back to their master. But by and large, Northerners kind of largely ignored this part of the Constitution, and there wasn't anything that required it to be enforced. So, like, if a Northerner helped somebody to run away through the Underground Railroad, there really wasn't necessarily a punishment for that. So this is why the government, the Southerners, wanted a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, because they were frustrated that the Northerners didn't follow this part of the Constitution. So this is the Fugitive Slave Act from the Compromise of 1850. It was created to keep the South happy and return runaway slaves to their owners by having some key points. One, before the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, people who were accused of running away were given sometimes a trial by jury. That was taken away. So accused runaway enslaved people did not have a right to a trial by jury. Instead, they were seen in front of a magistrate or one judge who was paid more to find in favor of a slave master. In fact, a judge was paid $10 to find in favor of a slave master and $5 to find in favor of the runaway slave. So they were already incentivized to return that person back to slavery. Number 3, the only required evidence that a person was a runaway slave was the testimony of a slave master. And that person who was being accused of being a runaway slave was not allowed to testify on their own behalf. So the only evidence was that, yep, that's my runaway slave. Or if you're a bounty hunter or a slave catcher, yep, that's the guy my master told me, or the master told me about. And that was it. So for bounty hunters and slave catchers, sometimes they didn't really care if they had the right person. They would be like, oh, did they just go snatch a person off the street and then say, this is the runaway slave, even if it wasn't. And that person would find themselves in bondage, even if they had never been a slave before. Number 4, forced local police to assist in the arrest and recovery of fugitive slaves in northern free states. So basically, they told the police, you have to help us catch fugitive slaves. If this person says that guy is a runaway slave, then you have to go arrest him. Even though slavery was illegal in the North, they were being forced to enforce Southern laws. And that's the way the North saw it, and that really upset them. And then number 5, this was the teeth behind the enforcement. If you got caught hiding or helping somebody run away, you could be punished up to $1,000 and time in jail. And I think that's about a $50,000 in today money fine and time in jail. That's a substantial amount of money, especially when back then, people made just a couple hundred to a few $100s a year. That was just unpayable, and it could ruin people's lives. Like if you are a husband and father and you get caught and fined $1,000 and put in jail, then your family is going to be really up a creek. So this was supposed to deter Northerners from helping people to run away. Instead, it kind of had a much different reaction. So this is actually from July 1837. Like I said, this was still in the Constitution, but it wasn't really all that uncommon for slave masters to take out ads in newspapers up north, or even in their own Southern newspapers, to advertise like, hey, I'm looking for this person who ran away. And this is a stereotypical picture that was placed into those newspapers to draw your attention, that there was a reward being offered for a runaway slave. But we also see that Northerners were like, well, what are some other ways that we can help people without getting ourselves in trouble? So they would post posters around their cities, like around Boston or New York, that says, hey, look, stay in your home or stay in hiding, because we've heard that there's going to be a raid looking for runaway slaves. So be on your guard. They're going to be out tonight. And so they would help to try to warn people so that they wouldn't get arrested. And then another thing that they would do is they would advocate on behalf of people who were arrested. First anniversary of the kidnapping of Thomas Sims by the city of Boston. So they would like rally around people trying to free them. Theodore Parker was an abolitionist of the time. So the Northerners are really going to have a very unhappy reaction to the Fugitive Slave Act. So there were some unintended consequences here. Instead of deterring people from helping people run away, it actually created more abolitionists among Northerners because they were so mad that they were basically being forced to enforce slavery, even when it was illegal in their own states. They were like, I didn't really care about that. Like I knew about it, it bothered me, but just wasn't something I really thought about. But now, because you're forcing me to do this, I care. So more people really joined the abolitionist cause because of the Fugitive Slave Act. They refused to obey the law. They just flouted it. They were like a little bit more careful about it so they wouldn't get caught. They threatened slave catchers' lives. Like if I see you around here again, they're not going to be able to find your body. And then they rescued people from police stations. So if an enslaved person was arrested and awaiting their trial, they would stage prison raids to get them out. Additionally, some cities said, you can't use our jails. You are making us use our police, but there's nothing in this law that says you can use our jails. So you can round up runaway slaves, but where are you going to put them while they await their trial? So they're creating like a logistical problem to enforce this law. The South was so outraged at the Northerners' anger that they threatened to secede again in 1851. And this is when President Millard Fillmore at the time started to really try to enforce this law because, again, we don't want the South to secede, and South has found that to be a pretty effective argument. So again, just some warnings that people were given. Caution, colored people of Boston, one and all, you are hereby respectfully cautioned and advised to avoid conversing with watchmen and police officers in Boston because they are now kidnappers and slave catchers. And then citizens of Boston, a free citizen of Massachusetts, free by Massachusetts law until his liberty is declared to be forfeited by a Massachusetts jury, is now imprisoned. And so again, going against this because in Massachusetts, everybody was given a right to trial by jury, and they feel that that is being undone. Another impact of the Fugitive Slave Act was the writing of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe and she had a sister, I think her name was Catherine Beecher. They had actually moved, I think from Massachusetts. I might be wrong on that. Don't quote me on that. But they had moved from Massachusetts to Cincinnati, Ohio in like the 1830s and had lived in Cincinnati, Ohio for 18 years. And one thing about Ohio is that it was not anymore, obviously, but it was a major way through fair, something like that. Like people would go through Ohio on the Underground Railroad to get to Canada. Thoroughfare. So that's the word I was looking for. Sorry. But Ohio was a major part of the Underground Railroad because of its connection to Canada. So when Harriet Beecher Stowe was living in Cincinnati, she encountered a lot of enslaved people running away, and she would talk to them and get their stories about their lives. And she was an abolitionist, of course. And she would write down the stories that they told her. And it really left an impression on her. And then she moved to Brunswick, Maine with her husband and small child. And she started to write these stories and send them into a magazine, an abolitionist magazine, and that magazine started publishing these stories. And it was in a serial. So it's a series, not cereal like you eat, but like in a series of stories. So every week the magazine would like publish a new story, or every couple of days. Whenever she would send them a new story, they would publish it. And the editor of the magazine was like, hey, so many people are asking about when the next story is coming out. Like, when are you going to send it? So I think she wrote somewhere around like 50 stories based on the lives of people that she met. And so finally the editor said, you need to compile this into a book. It is so popular. So she did. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. And the reason she started having these stories published in the 1850s was because of the Fugitive Slave Act. She knew about these stories, but had never had them published. But the Fugitive Slave Act had so upset her that she was like, it's time to publish these stories. So she wrote these down in Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a fictional novel based on the real stories from enslaved people escaping through the Underground Railroad. So Uncle Tom in the novel is an older Black gentleman who helps people to escape. Now, in today's understanding of Uncle Tom, that's not a good, like, Uncle Tom is not a good thing in the Black community, because the South took Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom and turned him into the stupid Black enslaved man who was happy to be an enslaved person, and da-da-da. So they completely upended the story that she had written. But Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom's Cabin was a man who helped people to escape. And along the way, you learn the stories of these people who are escaping to slavery. The book was incredibly popular. 300,000 copies were sold in the United States, and 1 million more were sold in Europe. Even Queen Victoria read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it made her cry. The book was so divisive that the South completely banned it. If you were caught publishing it or selling it, you could die in the South. They were so upset about this book. In fact, Southerners claimed that Stowe was lying and exaggerating about what slavery was actually like, that she made it sound so much worse than it was. But that's not true. They'd say that she was lying. So what she did was she created a bibliography. Like, these are the stories of real people that all of these people in my book are based on. So this is absolutely true. And what this book ended up doing was educating many Northerners about the horrors of slavery. See, slavery had always been in the public eye. Like, everybody knew it existed, but nobody really knew what it was like, especially if you lived in the North and you weren't surrounded by slavery. So when reading this book, it was very eye-opening. And a lot of people went, how have we let this exist in our country for so long? So it created a lot of abolitionists. A lot of people really said slavery should have no place in the United States. And it increased the tensions between North and South. Already the South is angry that the North is reacting so heavily against the Fugitive Slave Act by disobeying it. Now to them, this is further proof that the North is going to come after them and their way of life. So it creates a lot of tension. In fact, it's said that when Harriet Beecher Stowe met Abraham Lincoln after the Civil War started, he greeted her with, "So you're the little lady that started this great big war." We don't really know if that actually happened, or if he actually said that to her, but it had increase the strain between North and South. So if you want to, you can Google this. It's from CBN News, but it's a true story behind Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book that rocked the pre-Civil War America. It's really, really interesting story about this man. His name was Josiah, and that's who she based her Uncle Tom off of. And he's just a really incredible human being. So I'm not going to actually play it here for you because that would be weird. All right, up at issue number 4. So again, our essential question is, what were the laws and events that happened in the 1850s primarily that led us to the United States Civil War? So issue number 4 is the Kansas Territory. So I'm just going to pull up this map really quickly so you can see. The Kansas Territory is right here next to Missouri. And really, this issue involved Nebraska as well. So the Kansas and Nebraska territories, but it's really Kansas that becomes the problem. So Stephen Douglas was an Illinois senator, and leading in the 1850s, there was a lot of conversation in Congress about building a transcontinental railroad, but it wasn't happening because the South wanted the railroad to go through the South, and the Midwest, like Illinois and all that, wanted the railroad to go through there. And just remember, the Transcontinental Railroad was the railroad system that would link California to the East Coast. So Stephen Douglas really wanted this railroad to run through Illinois. He especially wanted it to run and have a stop in Chicago, which is where he lived, because he wanted Chicago to become like the New York City of the Midwest. He wanted it to be this financial success, and also he owned property there. So if he could have it be a financial success, then his property would grow and he would make more money, and it would bring Illinois, it would bring Chicago, it would bring the Midwest into prominence, because right now the two major powerhouses regionally, North and South. So he's hoping like like, maybe if we can make the Midwest get a little powerful, which would happen if we brought the railroad there, they can maybe balance out the north-south problem. So he wants to build this transcontinental railroad to have a stop in Chicago, but he couldn't do that because Kansas and Nebraska, while they're part of the Louisiana Purchase, they have been part of the United States since 1803. There hadn't been anything done with them. They were still considered wild country. They were unorganized. I mean, you might have a few settlers that lived there, but there was no territorial government, nothing like that. It was actually kind of considered Indian territory. So you couldn't build a railroad through these territories if there was no territorial government. They had to be organized so that that railroad could be built, which he knew would be problematic, especially after the Compromise of 1850. Even though when we look at the Kansas Territory, you see this line, this Missouri Compromise line. As per the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Kansas and Nebraska had to come into the United States as free territories. That was the law of the day. But Douglas knew that if he tried to organize these territories as free, it would never pass Congress. Southern senators and Southern representatives would never allow it. So he needed to come up with something to deal with the issue of slavery that might satisfy everybody. So what he did was he looked to the Compromise of 1850 and how it was handled with Utah and New Mexico. And in Utah and New Mexico, they used the idea of popular sovereignty, allowing the people to choose, the people who lived in Utah and New Mexico, to choose whether or not their territories would be free or allow slavery. And he thought, okay, this worked well there. Surely we can use that idea here. That's really not how it's going to pan out. And you can see, like, if you think about it, why did popular sovereignty work fairly well in Utah and New Mexico? Well, one, they weren't particularly suited to slavery. When you think of New Mexico, you typically don't think of farms. You might think of deserts. And so slavery is not going to be as popular there because what are you going to do, right? It's not going to work as well here, specifically in Kansas. Nebraska is not really going to be an issue, but Kansas. And if you look at Kansas, and if you know anything about Kansas, if you've ever driven through Kansas or seen pictures, you know that farming is huge in Kansas. And back in the 1850s, one of the things that you could have grown in Kansas very well would have been cotton and tobacco. So two things, actually. And you'll notice, too, that Kansas is surrounded by slave states. So the question is, how are we going to figure this out? Like, how are we going to get the Kansas and Nebraska territory organized while dealing with the slavery issue? So whether the new territories, the idea here that he puts through is called the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. And in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, he wrote into the law that the new territories would be free or slave should be decided by popular sovereignty for Kansas and Nebraska. In other words, get rid of the Missouri Compromise, repeal the Missouri Compromise, get rid of it, which they could do because it was just a law, and put this in its place. So what does that do? It would open Kansas and Nebraska to slavery. Again, not going to be a big issue with Nebraska. It's going to be a really big issue with Kansas. And when I say popular sovereignty, what I mean by that, popular is people, sovereignty is power. So the people, political power belong to the people, and the people decide whether or not they will allow slavery in the territory in which they live. So let's take it to its logical conclusion. If most of the people that live in Kansas are pro-slavery, then Kansas will become a slave state. If most people who live in Kansas are anti-slavery, they're free soil or abolitionists, I'll explain the free soil term in a second, then Kansas will come into the territory as a free state. To Stephen Douglas, you couldn't get much more democratic than that. Let the people decide. That's the way America should be in his mind. So if we draw this out to the logical conclusion, if more pro-slavery people live there, it becomes a slave state. If more anti-slavery people live there, it becomes a free state. It's going to lead to a really nasty competition. All right, so this is what the Kansas-Nebraska Act is going to do. Enjoy that map. All right, you can watch this video if you want to. It's on the PowerPoint. We're obviously not going to here. Sorry. All right, so here is the impact of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It weakened the Democratic Party, who split between those who supported the act and those who did not. There were Northern Democrats that did not want to see slavery spread into the new territories. We call those people free soil. They're not necessarily against slavery where it exists in the southern states, but they don't want it to go into new territories. And then, of course, you have the Southern Democrats who are like, all right, this is good because it's opening for the first time the Louisiana Purchase territory to slavery. So now they can take their slaves there, whereas previously they could not. It killed the Whig Party. If you guys remember, during Andrew Jackson's presidency, a whole new political party formed called the Whigs. They formed because they hated Andrew Jackson. And the people who belonged to the Whigs lived in both the North and the South. And of course, this is going to split them because you have the conscience Whigs who did not like slavery, for moral reasons. They didn't want to see it spread, so they do not support Kansas, Nebraska. And then you have the Cotton Whigs, who you could actually find in both the North and the South. These were Whigs that believed in and realized that cotton was really important for northern factories and for plantation owners. So those two, they cannot reconcile with each other. So the Whig Party dies. The Cotton Whigs will join the Democratic Party, and the Conscience Whigs will join the brand new Republican Party that was created because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the Republican Party is going to include the Conscience Whigs, the Northern Democrats who did not support the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and the Free Soil Party. Again, free soil just means people who did not want to see slavery spread. And it wasn't always for moral reasons. Sometimes people who wanted free soil, they wanted free soil because they didn't want Black people to live out west because they believed it degraded the white race. So again, sometimes the reason people join political parties is very nuanced. They may not follow the direct party line. So you see that here with the Free Soil Party. So the Republican Party was created in Wisconsin as a reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And then the other impact that we're getting ready to talk about is Bleeding Kansas, because it is its own separate issue. So let's go ahead and talk about issue number 5, Bleeding Kansas. This was caused by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Because the people got to choose, it depended on majority rule. So if most of the people, again, who lived there were pro-slavery, Kansas would be a slave state. If most of the people who lived there were anti-slavery, then Kansas would be a free state. So they competed. There was actually an organization created in New England called the New England Emigrant Aid Society, and they would fund people living in New England, like abolitionists and free soilers who lived in New England. They would advertise and say, hey, do you want a new life in Kansas? We'll pay for you to relocate. We'll help you buy land. We'll help you get the things that you need to become a farmer. We just want to get as many abolitionists and free soil people to go live in Kansas as much as we possibly can so that Kansas will come into the nation as a free state. And of course, pro-slavery groups, they don't necessarily live in Kansas, and we'll talk about that in a second, but some of them do. So you're going to see them also flooding into Kansas to get Kansas in as a slave state. So this becomes a very, very violent competition that actually leads to a horrific civil war in Kansas. They actually had actual battles on battlefields with opposing armies and opposing commanders. It took the United States government sending in federal troops to end the actual battlefield fighting of the Kansas Civil War, but guerrilla style fighting will continue until 1865. So while the rest of the United States experienced a civil war from 1861 to 1865, Kansas was in this war for about 10 years. So it was pretty nasty. And then, of course, you can watch this if you want to. It's on the PowerPoint that you guys can access. So here's how popular sovereignty works. And this is why it led to such a competition. So the way it works is that voters will elect a legislature, a Congress, to make their laws that would pass laws that would either support or go against slavery. So the voters select their lawmakers. Before the territory can become a state, they must write a constitution. So once you hit a certain number of people in the population, you can apply for statehood to the United States Congress. And before you do that, though, you have to have a constitution that you submit with your application. So the way this works is that the people ultimately will vote on the Constitution. So that fills out your notes. Like they select a constitutional convention. The Constitutional Convention writes the Constitution. They send the Constitution with the application to Congress. Congress approves or denies it. And then it goes back to the people for a vote. So ultimately, the people will vote on the Constitution. And this Constitution would write out whether or not the new state would be free or slave. So whichever group controls the territory controls the Constitutional Convention. So again, if more pro-slavery people live in Kansas, they will elect a pro-slavery Constitutional Convention. If more anti-slavery people live in the territory, they will elect an anti-slavery convention, and that will determine the Constitution. So again, it's that majority rules concept that popular sovereignty is going to work off of. So in 1855, Kansas actually got to have its first territorial elections. A lot of people lived there because of that competition. They flooded Kansas, and they held their first election, and through fraud and intimidation, the pro-slavery faction won control of the territorial government. And the reason it was fraud and intimidation was because when you looked at the population actually living in Kansas, having homes in Kansas, living in Kansas, the free soil population was actually the biggest. They had the majority of the people who lived in Kansas, which meant that the government should have been free soil. But what you had was this group called the Missouri Ruffians, and they hopped the border. So if you guys remember that map from earlier, Kansas borders Missouri, and Missouri is a slave state. The Border Ruffians jumped over the border on election day and voted. They also, in some cases, pro-slavery people stuffed the ballot boxes, meaning that they put like 5 votes in for themselves, or, picked people who didn't exist and they voted, made them vote. They also, pro-slavery advocates would sit by the ballot boxes with their guns and intimidate and even sometimes use violence to keep free soil people from voting. And you just have to remember that they were able to do that because voting wasn't done in secret. It's not like it is today where nobody can know who you voted for when you go to vote. Everybody knew who you voted for when you voted back then because you had one ballot box for one guy, one ballot box for the other guy, or 2 different colors, papers, or you spoke your vote out loud. So if somebody's sitting there with a gun and you don't feel like dying that day, you might not go vote. So they suppressed the free soil vote, and that's how they got elected. And the reason the guys who lived in Missouri voted and they let them vote was they said, well, look, in the rules, it doesn't say how long you have to live in Kansas. It just says to be a resident of Kansas, you can't have any plans to leave. So today, I didn't have any plans to leave. And then for whatever reason, I had to go home. But for that moment, I was a resident of Kansas, so my vote should count. So of course, the pro-slavery government wins because of these things, and they put their official government in Lecompton, Kansas. Well, Free Soilers absolutely disagreed with this election. So they formed their own government. They held their own free soil election and formed their own government in Topeka, Kansas. So now you have 2 competing governments in Kansas, one in Lecompton that's pro-slavery and one in Topeka that's anti-slavery. So, this is going to end really, really well, and you can watch that video if you want to. So here's what happens. President Pierce, who was a Democrat from New Hampshire, really hated abolitionists, did not like them at all. He accused the Topeka government of being a government in rebellion because the official government, the accepted government for him, was the government in Lecompton. So what that did was it emboldened the pro-slavery people in Kansas. So the pro-slavery governor of Kansas, the territory of Kansas, said, the Topeka government is committing treason against the territory of Kansas. So he ordered the arrest of all of the politicians for Topeka, all the free soil politicians that were in the Topeka government. So this sheriff took 800 pro-slavery men with him, it's a bit of an overkill, to arrest these men where they lived in Lawrence, Kansas. But when they got there, the men were gone. So the pro-slavery guys, the 800 men, decided to absolutely destroy the town of Lawrence. They burned it, they ransacked it. It was absolutely just leveled by these men who went absolutely crazy. And so when word of this gets back to the East Coast, to DC, people were astounded, especially Northerners who began to view pro-slavery advocates as barbaric and willing to stop at nothing to shove slavery down their throats. Like, you will accept this or we will destroy your towns. And it influenced the actions of a man by the name of John Brown, whom we'll get to in just a second.